Take a close look at this woman. At 71 years old, she's watching her own children take everything she has. They call her a burden and are even taking her last keepsake radio. They are leaving her behind in an empty house. But they don't know that this cruel act is about to attract the attention of an army general, and justice is on its way. Before the story begins, what city or country are you watching from? Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. The afternoon sun set over the cracked asphalt streets of Oak Creek, Virginia, kicking up a fine dust that seeped through the window of the small house. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Hailey, Martin's sister, coldly picked up Clara's old radio. Her voice rang out, devoid of emotion. "It doesn't work anymore, Mom. It just takes up space." Clara, 71, stood frozen in the doorway. Her hands, worn by a lifetime of work, trembled as she clutched her faded apron. She watched Martin pace back and forth, his brow furrowed. Suddenly, he slammed the refrigerator shut, the thud echoing through the silent house. "Mom!" Martin snapped, refusing to meet her eyes. "We can't take care of you anymore. You're better off here alone. We have our own families, our own lives." Her small body, wrapped in a faded apron, seemed fragile, a testament to her 71 years, but her eyes were still the same ones that had once looked at those two children with pride and sacrifice. She watched in silence as Martin and Hailey, with mechanical movements and impatient gestures, loaded her things into the pickup truck parked outside. It was an old blue Ford F-150 with the logo of Oak Creek Hardware, a store that Martin now managed. And in its bed, the refrigerator, the tube television, and even a couple of chairs that, they said, were broken and no longer useful, were piled up. Clara felt something tear in her chest as she watched the little furniture she had managed to gather over years of work being taken from her house without her being able to do anything to stop it. Martin finally stopped, wiping sweat from his brow. He wouldn't meet her eye. "Mom," he said, his voice flat, "we can't take care of you anymore. You're better off here. The city is complicated. We have our own families, our own lives," Hailey added quickly, adjusting the radio under her arm. Martin just nodded, turning back to secure the refrigerator with a rope. Clara wanted to speak, wanted to beg them not to leave her alone, but the words were stuck in her throat like a knot impossible to untie. She swallowed hard, feeling tears threatening to overflow. Her gaze swept over these two adults, who were once children running barefoot through the same kitchen they were now emptying without remorse. She remembered the sleepless nights working double shifts at the diner to pay for their school, the days she went without food so they would have enough on their plates, the times she went to work with a fever so as not to lose the wages that kept them afloat. With a thread of a voice that was barely audible over the distant roar of an engine, Clara said, "I never left you alone. I never left you hungry or cold. I never abandoned you, and now you think I'm better off here alone, like an old piece of furniture that's in the way." Hailey frowned and told her not to exaggerate, that it wasn't abandonment, but what was best for everyone, that the house was in good condition and that she could manage on her own. Martin came over to give her a quick kiss on the cheek, but avoided looking her in the eye. "Take care, Mom," he said in a tone that sounded more like an obligation than affection before turning and getting into the truck. Hailey followed in his footsteps without saying goodbye. The vehicle door slammed shut, and Clara felt the sound was like the final door slam on a lifetime of sacrifices. The pickup drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that got into Clara's eyes, making them burn even more. She stood there in the doorway, her hands clenched against her apron, watching as the figures of her children grew smaller and smaller in the distance. The silence that fell afterward was absolute, broken only by the whistling of the wind seeping through the poorly closed window. Clara walked slowly to the kitchen and sat in the remaining chair, her eyes falling on the blank wall where the radio used to be. The hollowness in her chest felt vast and cold. She sat there as the light faded, a ghost in her own home, her sacrifices forgotten. The silence in the house became Clara's only companion. Days melted into weeks, weeks into seasons. The first winter was the hardest. The cold seeped through the cracks, a physical ache that matched the hollowness in her chest. She survived on a meager pension, on the occasional kindness of a neighbor who would leave a small bag of groceries at her door, never staying long enough to witness her shame. She would sit for hours in that one remaining chair, staring at the blank wall where her radio had been. Time was no longer measured by joy, but by survival. Months passed. The world outside moved on, but Clara's world had stopped, frozen in the moment the truck's engine faded. She became a ghost in her own home, her sacrifices forgotten. The sharp pain of betrayal slowly turned into a dull, constant ache, a part of her, like her own bones. "Darling, if only you knew how lonely I am," she murmured to the empty room, her voice breaking. She brought her hands to her face, feeling the wetness of her own tears sliding down her cheeks. Outside, the sky, which had been clear, was darkening with heavy clouds, as if the heavens themselves were preparing to cry for her. The rain began that evening, and by the next afternoon, it had become a deluge, falling with tremendous force on the cracked streets of Oak Creek. The water pounded on the tin roofs with a constant roar, like a war drum that gave no truce. The wind swept away leaves, plastic bags, and even the forgotten toys of children who had been running around hours earlier under a harsh sun. But now the streets were empty, and only a small figure remained in the middle of the storm. Clara, with her gray hair stuck to her forehead and her apron soaked, gripped a worn-out broom and swept the entrance of her house with slow but determined movements. Each sweep was like an act of resistance against the loneliness and sadness that had enveloped her since the day her children left, taking almost everything she had, even the radio that kept her company on the quietest days. She was barefoot because her sandals had broken, and she didn't want to wear out the only good pair of shoes she had left. Her feet wrinkled from the icy water that ran like small rivers down the street. But she continued sweeping, as if cleaning could restore order to a world that had suddenly become alien and cold. The rain beat down on her stooped shoulders, and every so often Clara would look up at the dark sky, feeling the weight of the heavy clouds and the hum of the wind seeping through the cracks of the neighboring houses. The cold seeped into her bones. A slight tremor ran through her hands, but she did not stop. She muttered quiet words that only she could hear. Phrases like, "I have to keep it clean, no matter the rain, because the house must look dignified, even if no one comes to visit me, even if no one else cares about this old woman." The sound of the broom scraping against the wet ground mixed with the patter of the raindrops and the howling of the wind, creating a kind of sad music that accompanied her thoughts. It was then that a different noise broke the monotony of the storm. Clara turned her head and saw in the distance a figure running down the street, a tall, sturdy silhouette covered in a dark uniform, his boots splashing in the puddles, while the water fell on him like an endless waterfall. The man seemed in a hurry, but suddenly his right foot slipped in the mud, and the weight of his body overcame him, causing him to fall to his knees with a violent splash that sent drops in all directions. Clara stopped sweeping and watched him with a mixture of surprise and alarm, because that man did not get up immediately, but remained there with his hands on the ground and his shoulders trembling strangely. She squinted and realized that the trembling was not from the cold, but from the sobs that shook his chest. The sound was muffled, but clear enough to reach her amidst the roar of the rain. For a moment, Clara felt paralyzed, the broom suspended in the air as she watched the scene that seemed torn from a bad dream. Then, almost without thinking, she leaned the broom against the wall and went into the house to get an old umbrella she kept behind the door. It was such a worn-out contraption that its metal ribs poked through the torn fabric, but it was all she could offer. She went out into the storm again, feeling the wind snatch her breath away and soak her apron even more, and began to walk toward the man who was still kneeling in the mud, as if the weight of the world had settled on his back. With each step, Clara could see more details of that stranger. The soaked uniform clung to his muscular body, his boots were covered in mud, and his cap had fallen a few feet away. But what caught her attention the most was the face hidden between his large, trembling hands, his fingers clenched, and his shoulders rising and falling with each sob, as if the pain were tearing the air from him. Clara lifted the umbrella over them, but a gust of wind hit it with such force that the fabric tore away from the ribs, leaving only a useless metal skeleton. Still, the woman did not back down. She bent down a little to look at the man and said in a voice trembling from the cold, "Young man, are you all right? Do you need help? Maybe a doctor or some hot water?" The man lifted his head abruptly, and Clara could see his reddened eyes and devastated expression. For a moment he said nothing, just looked at her as if he had seen a ghost, as if he couldn't believe someone was there with him in the rain. Then his voice came out in a heart-wrenching cry that mixed with the thunder that rumbled overhead. "Mother, "Forgive me," he cried with a desperation so raw that a shiver ran down Clara's spine from her neck to her feet. "Mother, please, forgive me for not being by your side when you needed me most." The sound of that lament seemed to contain all the sadness in the world, and the old woman felt a lump in her throat, because although she didn't know this man, something in his words felt painfully familiar, as if he were speaking for all the children who one day forgot the mothers who loved them with all their being. Clara remained. In the middle of the storm, two kinds of grief collide. He is desperate for a mother he lost, and Clara is desperate for a child who remembers her. This chance encounter is about to change both of their lives, and you'll want to see how. Motionless, the rain running down her cheeks, mixing with tears she didn't remember starting to shed. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her motherly instinct, the one that never disappears no matter the age or the wounds, pushed her to get a little closer. She placed a trembling hand on the stranger's shoulder and felt the warmth of his skin mixed with the cold of the storm. "Son, I don't know who you are, but no one deserves to cry like this in the street. Come with me. I have hot coffee and a dry chair where you can sit." The man looked at her again, his eyes glassy and his face streaked with tears. And Clara knew in that instant that something was broken in him, a deep wound that she might not be able to see, but that she recognized because it was the same emptiness she had felt in her own heart since they left her alone. Clara walked slowly back to her house, the rain beating on her thin body as if it wanted to pierce her skin, her bare feet splashing in the cold mud, while she felt that each step was heavier than the last, not because of physical exhaustion, but because of the overwhelming presence of that unknown man who walked beside her with his head bowed and his soaked uniform clinging to his body, as if the weight of guilt prevented him from keeping his back straight. She could barely hold the broken umbrella that dangled uselessly from her right hand, but she didn't dare let it go because it seemed like a gesture of courtesy, even though she knew it was no longer useful. Upon reaching the small entrance of her house, Clara pushed the wooden door, which creaked with a mournful sound, and said, "Come in, don't be shy. It's humble, but there's warmth and silence." The man looked up for a moment and murmured a thank you that was barely audible. His reddened eyes seemed unable to hold her gaze, and Clara felt a beat of compassion in her chest, like a drum pounding hard against her ribs. The kitchen was dark, but a small kerosene lamp on the table cast a warm light that drew shadows on the bare walls. The aroma of reheated coffee filled the air, along with the sound of water dripping from the roof tiles. Clara indicated a chair with a wave of her hand and said, "Sit down. You must be exhausted and cold as a stone." The man obeyed without a word and sank into the chair with a long sigh that sounded like defeat. She went to the cupboard with short steps and took out a glass that had once been transparent but now had a whitish film. She poured some water from a plastic pitcher and added 2 spoonfuls of sugar, saying, "Sugar water calms the soul's trembling and sometimes tricks the heart so it doesn't hurt so much." She returned with the glass in her hand and offered it to him carefully, as one who offers something sacred. The man raised his large, rough hands to take it, but Clara noticed they were trembling so much that it seemed the glass might slip at any moment. He looked at her with glassy eyes and said in a choked voice, "I couldn't say goodbye to her. I wasn't there when she closed her eyes for the last time. And even though I was by her side my whole life, I wasn't there when she needed me most, and that's killing me inside." The words came out in fits and starts, as if each one tore a piece of his soul away. And Clara felt her own eyes fill with tears, because although she didn't know this man, she could recognize the anguish of a son who loved too late and was met with the cruel certainty of loss. She moved a little closer until she could smell the scent of wet earth and sweat emanating from his uniform, and without a word, she placed her own shawl over his shoulders. It was a worn piece of fabric with faded flowers, but it still held the warmth of her body. And she said, "It's not much, but maybe it will help you remember that someone can still cover you from the cold." The man closed his eyes tightly, and a thick tear rolled down his cheek, disappearing into his unkempt beard. Clara stood beside him like a silent presence, and after a moment, she began to hum softly a song she had sung 1,000 times to her children when they were little to help them fall asleep. "You Are My Sunshine" came from her lips like a whisper floating in the damp air. The notes, trembling but full of tenderness, seeped into the man's ears, and something inside him broke definitively. His shoulders shook first with a contained spasm, and then with an uncontrollable weeping that burst forth like an overflowing river. He cried like a lost child, his hands covering his face, while the sobs filled the humble kitchen and mixed with Clara's soft singing, which didn't stop because she knew that in that moment her voice was the only thing keeping that man connected to life. The old woman felt her heart beat to the rhythm of another's pain, and for a moment she could almost forget her own loneliness, because she understood that shared pain could also be a form of comfort. The man said between tears, "I don't deserve forgiveness, not even from God." And Clara replied, "A son always deserves his mother's forgiveness, because motherhood doesn't understand grudges, and blood doesn't know judgment." He looked at her with reddened eyes, and in that silent exchange, they both understood that in the midst of the rain, the cold, and the sadness, a strange connection had formed, as if life were giving them a second chance to mend wounds that were not from the same thread, but from the same human fabric that unites those who suffer and those who love with a force more powerful than guilt and distance. The rain continued to fall furiously on the tin roof of Clara's small house. Each drop hit like a relentless drum that filled the kitchen with a constant, almost hypnotic murmur, while the kerosene lamp on the table projected trembling shadows on the bare, damp walls. Vincent, the man in the uniform who had just moments before fallen to his knees on the street, was still sitting in the wooden chair, his body leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. His large, rough hands partially covered his face, but Clara could see the tears sliding down his cheeks, marking little paths in the dirt and water that still beaded on his skin. There was something profoundly human in that image of a strong man, perhaps accustomed to giving orders and maintaining control, now reduced to a bundle of pain so raw that he didn't even try to hide it. And Clara felt a shiver in her chest, not just of compassion, but of a silent recognition that this man carried a wound in his soul so similar to hers that she could almost feel it on her own skin. He slowly lifted his head, his red, swollen eyes fixed on Clara's, with an intensity that made her hold her breath for a moment, and with a voice broken by sobs, he said, "My mother died 3 weeks ago, and I couldn't hold her hand when she closed her eyes for the last time. I wasn't there because duty called, and now I feel like I betrayed her, that I abandoned her at the most crucial moment, and that weight won't let me sleep, won't let me breathe. And when I saw you on the street, under the rain with that shawl on your shoulders and the broom in your hands, I felt as if my mother had come back for a moment, as if fate were giving me a chance to tell her what I could never say in her lifetime." Clara listened to him with a heavy heart, her wrinkled hands twisted in her damp apron as her own eyes filled with tears, not because Vincent's words evoked pity, but because they touched very deep fibers within her being, the same fibers she had tried to quiet so many nights while talking to her old radio to keep from losing her sanity in the loneliness her children had imposed on her. With a calmness that surprised even herself, Clara took another step closer and placed a warm hand on the man's. His cold, trembling fingers flinched under her touch, and with a shaky but firm voice, she said, "My children also left me alone in this house, as if I were an old piece of furniture in the way, as if the years I spent working late shifts to pay for their school and the meals I skipped so they would have enough never existed. But a mother's heart never dies. Even if they hurt me, even if they forget me, I still love them because being a mother is like that. A love that asks for nothing in return, that keeps beating even in the emptiness." Vincent pressed his lips together, and another sob escaped his chest. He looked down as if he couldn't bear the weight of his own emotions, and Clara, with a slow, almost ritualistic gesture, removed her shawl from her shoulders and placed it over the man's, enveloping him in a warmth that was not only physical, but also symbolic. It was as if she were passing him a torch of love and comfort, a gesture that said without words that he was not alone, that there is always someone willing to extend a hand. Vincent looked up. His eyes reflected a whirlwind of guilt, sadness, and something deeper that Clara recognized instantly, a desperate need for redemption. Then he took Clara's hand tightly, like someone clinging to a life raft in the middle of a storm. His firm but trembling fingers wrapped around hers, and he said, "I will come back, I promise you. I can't change what happened with my mother, but I can do something for you. I can make sure you never feel alone again. They will never leave you in the rain or in the cold again. I will come back, and I will bring everything you need to live with dignity, because you reminded me that a mother's love is the only thing that can save us, even when we believe all is lost. Clara felt a lump in her throat, her eyes fixed on Vincent's, as if she wanted to engrave in her memory every word, every tear, every gesture of this man she barely knew but somehow already felt close to. And she said in a whisper, "Don't promise what you can't deliver, because promises are seeds that, if they don't sprout, leave an even bigger void than before." But Vincent replied, "This time, I will not fail. I swear it on my mother's memory." A soldier's promise, sworn on his mother's memory, is a powerful thing. But for Clara, who has only known betrayal, this hope is fragile. The next morning will reveal if this was just a kind word or the beginning of justice. At that very moment, as if the heavens themselves had heard his words, the rain stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so sudden and absolute that they both remained motionless. The only sound was the dripping of the leaves, still heavy with water, and the distant buzz of an insect in the night that was just beginning to unfold its cloak over the neighborhood. Vincent and Clara remained with their hands joined, their breaths synchronized, and the warmth of their palms melted into a simple but meaningful gesture. Neither of them wanted to let go first, because they both knew that in that touch there was more than momentary comfort. It was a silent pact between two wounded souls who had found an unexpected refuge in each other, a pact that would unite them beyond blood, beyond loss, beyond the storm that had just passed. The dawn in Oak Creek used to be quiet, slow, almost sacred. Roosters crowed in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of freshly baked bread from the corner bakery. The cracked streets, still damp from the previous night's rain, remained empty with still puddles reflecting the grayish skies of a neighborhood waking up without a rush. Clara was asleep, sitting in her wooden chair by the window, with a thin blanket over her legs, the kerosene lamp extinguished for hours, and the old floral tablecloth covering a table where her empty coffee cup and a worn rosary rested. The air was cool, almost cold, but she didn't move, as if in that corner she had found a way to keep breathing without thinking too much. Her face reflected the fragile serenity of those who learn to live with abandonment. That silence, however, was abruptly broken by a distant roar, a deep metallic sound that grew until it filled the air with a vibration unknown to those quiet streets. The dog started barking, and some windows were cautiously opened while Clara frowned, waking up startled. The sound was unlike any usual car or the motorcycles of the neighborhood youth. It was something bigger, more forceful, like a parade of steel and firm orders that brought with it a sense of movement and expectation. Clara stood up slowly, her knees creaking slightly as she got up, and approached the door with unsure steps. She opened the old wooden latch, pushed hard on the door that sometimes got stuck from the humidity, and when she peeked her head out, what she saw took her breath away. In front of her small house, parked in perfect formation on the still muddy street, were 10 dark green U.S. Army trucks with golden insignias. Beside them, dozens of soldiers were nimbly disembarking, unloading boxes, furniture wrapped in plastic, new mattresses, bundles of food, and even a large, new radio that gleamed in the dim morning light. Some neighbors began to come out in their pajamas. Others watched from their windows, all with the same expression of astonishment, as if they had witnessed a divine apparition. The older women crossed themselves and murmured among themselves that perhaps they had come for some criminal. Others assumed it was a visit from the president, but no one could understand why all this was happening on the most forgotten street of Oak Creek, right in front of the house of a humble old woman who barely had enough to heat some coffee. Clara stood motionless with the door ajar and a hand on her chest, trying to understand if she was dreaming or if she was really seeing those uniformed men carrying shiny new furniture into her yard. One of the soldiers, with a kind face, approached and told her not to worry, that everything was under control. They just needed to know where to put things. Clara didn't understand. She opened the door wider and stepped out onto the porch barefoot, clutching the shawl to her body, her eyes so wide they almost shone. Then she saw him among the soldiers, walking with a firm step. Vincent appeared in an impeccable uniform, with his cap on and his boots clean, as if he had never stepped in mud. His presence was imposing yet approachable, a figure that seemed to be from another reality, but who smiled at her as if he had known her forever. He approached Clara, took off his cap in a gesture of respect, and said, "Mother, you will never be alone again." This is the moment justice arrives, not quietly, but with 10 army trucks. He didn't just keep his promise, he delivered a miracle. Clara is finally being seen, but this grand gesture is about to send shockwaves that will reach the very people who abandoned her. Clara felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold, but from an emotion so deep she didn't know how to name it. She looked at Vincent, her eyes clouded with tears, and wanted to say something, but could only bring a hand to her mouth and let out a choked sigh. Vincent continued speaking, gesturing with his hand towards the trucks. He said he had kept his promise, that now she would have a dignified home, a new bed to rest in, and a big radio so she would never have to sing alone again. Clara listened to him attentively, without moving, as if each word were a caress to the soul that had been so empty for so long. The neighbors began to murmur among themselves. Some discreetly approached to see what the soldiers were unloading. A shiny new refrigerator, a sparkling stove, a rocking chair with soft cushions, even a small television wrapped in plastic. The neighborhood children began to gather on the sidewalk, watching in fascination as the military men placed everything with care and respect, as if they were setting up a queen's home. Clara, still not fully understanding how it was possible, turned to Vincent and with a trembling voice asked him why he was doing all this, who he really was, why he cared about an old woman he didn't even know. Vincent looked at her tenderly and replied that his mother, before she died, taught him that there are bonds that go beyond blood, that a mother is not only the one who gives life, but also the one who teaches you to feel. And that night in the rain, when she held out her hand to him and sang to him as if he were her own son, he understood that God had given him a second chance to care for someone who truly needed it. Clara felt the tears fall one after another down her cheeks and said that no one in her life had ever spoken to her with such truth, that her own children never said those words to her, that she felt alive for the first time in a long time. Vincent then offered her his arm as if inviting her to a dance and told her to go inside now, to see with her own eyes how her house had changed, that it was no longer just a place to wait for death, but a space to live with dignity and joy. Clara walked beside him, surrounded by the astonished gazes of the entire neighborhood, with children running around and soldiers saluting with respect. Upon entering her house, the first thing she saw was the new dining table with a clean tablecloth, the sturdy chairs, the radio on with a soft Elvis Presley song filling the air with a sweet nostalgia. And beyond, in the corner where she used to sleep on an old mattress, there was now a large bed with white sheets and fluffy pillows. She put a hand to her chest, closed her eyes, and said in a low voice, "This is a miracle." But Vincent corrected her, saying, "No, this is justice." Clara turned to hug him, and he let himself be enveloped in her arms as if they had both been waiting for this moment their whole lives. Outside, the street was still filled with murmurs, excited faces, whispers about what they had just witnessed. But in the heart of that small house in Oak Creek, 2 broken souls began to heal with the simple language of care and gratitude. Clara, with trembling hands, approached the new radio, turned the dial carefully until she found the song she was looking for, and when the first chords of "You Are My Sunshine" began to play, she allowed herself to smile with a light in her eyes she hadn't had in a long time, while Vincent, standing by her side, nodded in silence, knowing that he had kept a promise that not only changed her life, but also his. The sun began to peek shyly through the gray clouds that still floated heavily over the Oak Creek neighborhood, illuminating the damp streets and puddles with golden flashes, reflecting a sky freshly washed by the previous night's storm. The air smelled of wet earth and a faint perfume of wildflowers that grew along the cracked sidewalks. Clara stood at the entrance of her house, her hands clasped over her apron and her eyes filled with emotion, observing the transformation of her small home, which until recently was a sad and empty space, and was now filled with new furniture, warm colors, and the bustle of uniformed men working with impeccable synchrony, placing everything in its place with a respect and delicacy that seemed almost ritualistic. In front of the house, a group of children had gathered in a semicircle. Their eyes shone with the innocence and curiosity that only a child can have at such an unusual spectacle. They watched in fascination as the soldiers unloaded boxes of rice, beans, sugar, and also those who carried a sofa wrapped in clear plastic, advancing with a firm step as the wood creaked under their boots. One of the children, a little boy with messy hair and scraped knees named Caleb, dared to take a couple of steps toward Clara and asked with a trembling voice if all those strong men and huge trucks were her family. Clara looked at him tenderly and, holding back the tears that threatened to roll down her wrinkled cheeks again, replied that maybe they were, that maybe life was finally giving her the family she had always dreamed of, but never thought she would have in that way. The children looked at each other in amazement and began to laugh and applaud softly, as if they understood without words that something special was happening. Inside the house, Vincent moved with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what he is doing. He had his uniform shirt rolled up to his elbows and a screwdriver in his hand, patiently tightening the last screws of the new radio he had just installed on a small table next to the window. Every movement was careful, almost reverent, as if he didn't want to spoil the magic of that moment when a humble house began to beat with life and hope again. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a white handkerchief he took from his pocket and turned to Clara with a serene smile. He told her, "It's ready, Mother. Now you can listen to all the songs you want, the same ones that used to accompany you on the old radio they took from you." Clara took a step forward, touched the device with her fingertips as if it were a sacred object, and whispered, "I never imagined having such a beautiful radio again. I feel like the music is about to fill not just the house, but also the empty spaces in my heart." Vincent pressed a button, and immediately the familiar chords of "You Are My Sunshine" began to fill the room. The warm melody vibrated on the walls, a gentle reminder of their first meeting, making even the soldiers stop for a moment to listen. Some even smiled wistfully, perhaps remembering their own mothers or the homes they had left behind. Clara closed her eyes and let the melody envelop her. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm, at first shyly, just a slight movement of her shoulders and hips, then with more freedom, until her bare feet began to slide on the concrete floor, as if recovering the memory of a youth where dancing was synonymous with joy. Her arms, thin but still strong, rose slightly and twirled in the air as her lips murmured the lyrics she knew by heart. The tears began to flow without her being able to stop them. But they were not tears of sadness, but of an emotion so deep and overwhelming that it felt like a rebirth. Vincent watched her from the doorway, his arms crossed and his back leaning against the frame, and in his eyes there was a mixture of admiration, respect, and a tenderness he rarely allowed himself to show. The noise of the children continued on the street, but for Vincent and Clara there was only the music, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and that moment of shared humanity. When the song reached its end and the last note faded into the air, Vincent straightened up and took a step inside. His voice was low but clear, filled with a sentiment so sincere it almost seemed like a whisper to Clara's own soul. Clara stood motionless, tears still shining on her cheeks, and felt those words pierce the loneliness that had enveloped her for years, suddenly breaking the invisible chains of abandonment, filling her chest with a warmth she hadn't felt since her own children had stopped calling her mother. The soldiers discreetly began to withdraw, leaving the house spotless and the yard clean, while the children still peeked from the street, waving and smiling at Clara, as if recognizing in her the neighborhood grandmother, the strong woman who had survived everything, and who now deserved every gesture of kindness. Vincent walked to the table and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers that one of his men had brought from the road. He told Clara they were simple, but beautiful like her. Clara took the flowers with trembling hands and replied that no one had brought her flowers since her husband died, that she felt like a young woman again, alive, important, loved. Vincent nodded with a sparkle in his eyes and said that was the purpose, that every day from now on she would feel that way, because there is no greater debt than that of a son to his mother, even if not by blood. And Clara, with a fragile but genuine smile, understood that at that moment she had gained a son she never dreamed of having, a son who came not to replace those who forgot her, but to remind her that love, when it is true, always finds its way back. The morning was filled with a sweet aroma of freshly baked bread that seeped through the cracks of the houses in the Oak Creek neighborhood. Children played barefoot on the damp earth that still held the memory of the storm from days before, and the sun, shy but constant, illuminated the peeling facades with a warm tone that made everything seem calm. Inside Clara's small house, the air smelled of fresh coffee and new wood, because the furniture that had arrived in the military trucks still gave off that clean, factory scent that contrasted so much with the smell of dampness that had been the main feature on those walls for years. Clara stood in the center of the kitchen, watching with teary but bright eyes as the new radio played a soft melody, the tune of "You Are My Sunshine," while her wrinkled hands distractedly caressed the padded back of a new chair at her table. There was an expression on her face that mixed gratitude and a serenity she hadn't felt in a long time. The serenity of knowing that, although late, life was giving her back a little of what she had given so much of without expecting anything in return. But that moment of peace was abruptly interrupted by the sound of an engine roaring outside, a screech of brakes, and then the slam of a truck door closing angrily, followed by angry voices that echoed down the dusty street. Martin was the first to appear in the doorway. His dirty boots left a trail of mud on the clean floor as he entered without asking permission. His dark eyes sparked with anger as they scanned every corner of the house, lingering especially on the new shiny stove, the gleaming refrigerator, and the sofa covered with a delicate floral throw. Clara stood motionless, but inside she felt a cold shadow squeeze her heart, as if the peace of the last few days had shattered with the force of falling glass. Behind Martin, Hailey entered, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her lips painted a bright red that couldn't hide the hardness of her expression. Her heels clicked on the concrete floor, with a tapping that seemed to mark the rhythm of the storm they brought with them. Martin raised his voice in a tone that mixed indignation and reproach and said, "This help isn't free, Mom. What are you doing with that man? Why are there soldiers in the street carrying furniture and food, as if you were some kind of neighborhood queen?" Clara looked at him without averting her gaze, and with the calm that comes with age and life scars, she replied, "Vincent was just keeping a promise. I didn't ask for anything, but he, in a gesture of kindness that my own children had forgotten, decided to help me." Hailey took a step forward. Her cold eyes scanned her from head to toe with a mixture of contempt and contained anger, and without hesitation, she accused, "You're embarrassing us in front of the neighborhood, Mom. Everyone is talking about you as if you're the pet project of some soldier, and we have to put up with the comments and the stares. How do you think we feel knowing that our acquaintances are mocking us, saying our mother is selling herself for some furniture and food?" Clara felt a lump in her throat but swallowed it with dignity, because she knew her daughter's words were poison born of selfishness and not truth. She pressed her lips together and straightened as much as her stooped back would allow before saying in a firm voice, "I'm more ashamed of having raised you without a heart than of the neighbor's gossip, because the real scandal is not that a stranger lent me a hand, but that my own children forgot the mother who raised them alone when they were little." Martin opened his mouth to reply, but the words got stuck in his throat at his mother's unexpected strength, while Hailey looked away uncomfortably. A glimmer of remorse she tried to hide behind a facade of pride. Clara took a step toward them. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, but from the intensity of everything she felt, and she said, "While you were living comfortably, you forgot who taught you to walk and to say your first words. You forgot the nights I worked until my hands bled so you would never lack a plate of food. And now that age has made me weak, you come to judge me for accepting the affection of a man who isn't even my blood, but who sees me in a way you stopped seeing me years ago." Martin looked down for a second and then looked up again with a frown, saying he didn't understand why the mother he remembered as strong and proud would let herself be humiliated by accepting handouts. Clara let out a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades of unrecognized sacrifices and pains and replied, "It is not humiliating to receive love. Humiliation is needing it from those who should give it and finding only indifference." That is the sound of a woman who has found her dignity again. Her words are sharper than any weapon because they are the truth. Her children are stunned, but their malice is about to take a much darker turn. At that moment, the door opened gently, and Vincent appeared in the doorway. His impeccable uniform reflected the morning light, and his clean boots contrasted with the mud Martin had left upon entering. His eyes rested on Clara with warmth, and then on her children with a firmness that required no words to command respect. But he still spoke in a calm tone, saying, "I didn't come to steal your mother from you, or to take the place you should occupy. I only came to give her back the dignity you denied her." Martin looked at him with contained anger, but did not dare to respond. Hailey looked away, while Clara, with silent tears rolling down her cheeks, felt that in that instant the entire house was filled with a truth that none of her children could deny. The morning had begun with a strange calm, as if the air in the Oak Creek neighborhood knew that something terrible was about to happen. And that feeling seeped into the humble houses where women swept their yards with slow steps and children played without their usual joy. In Clara's house, the aroma of coffee mixed with a faint scent of dried flowers from a vase placed on the new table, a detail that Vincent had brought days before to brighten the atmosphere. Clara was sitting in the rocking chair that had arrived with the military trucks, her hands crossed in her lap and her eyes fixed on the door as if sensing the approaching storm. There was something in the silence, in the distant hum of an approaching engine, that made her clench her fingers on the floral shawl tighter than usual. Vincent's voice still echoed in her mind, the firm promise that she would never be alone again. But a knot in her stomach told her that the world didn't always respect promises, not when the selfishness and greed of her own children circled her like vultures. The gray SUV stopped in front of the house, kicking up dry dust that stuck to the garden flowers. Two men in suits got out with folders in their hands and hard looks that had no room for compassion. Behind them, Hailey emerged with the air of someone who believes they are in complete control. Her hair pulled back precisely and her lips tight in a thin line that revealed no emotion. Martin was nowhere in sight, perhaps too cowardly to face the act they were about to commit. Clara stood up with difficulty from the rocking chair, leaning on the edge of the table to keep her balance. Her legs trembled not only from age but from the mixture of fear and despair that oppressed her chest like an invisible yoke. The men in suits approached, and one of them said in an impersonal voice that they had an order signed by her daughter to admit her to a specialized senior care facility, alleging dementia and an inability to care for herself. Clara felt the words fall on her like icy stones. Her throat closed up, and she could barely murmur that she was perfectly lucid, that she didn't need anyone to lock her up. But Hailey stepped forward with firm steps and said, "Mom, this is what's best for you. You can't keep living on charity or being a spectacle for the neighborhood. You need professional attention. Besides, you're no longer in a condition to make clear decisions. Believe me, I'm doing this for your own good." The neighbors began to come out of their houses. Women in aprons and men with their hands in their pockets watched the scene with indignant faces. One of them shouted, "What you're doing is unjust! Mrs. Clara was always good to everyone, and now you're treating her like a burden." Another neighbor added, "She's not demented, she just has ungrateful children who don't want to take responsibility." But the officials paid no mind. They simply read the document once more and prepared to take Clara away. The old woman felt the world crumble beneath her feet. Her hands trembled as she tried to hold on to the doorframe while tears began to roll down uncontrollably. She tried to step back, but the men gently took her by the arms and guided her towards the SUV. Clara pleaded, looking at Hailey with desperate eyes, saying, "Daughter, don't do this. I've loved you all my life. I took care of you with my own hands. When you were sick, I defended you from the whole world, and now you repay me with imprisonment." But Hailey turned her face so as not to look at her directly and said, "Someday, you'll understand that this was necessary." The neighbors raised their voices again. A chorus of protests filled the street as women banged pots and pans and children watched with fear from the corners. But the men in suits were unfazed and continued their task with the efficiency of those who have done this many times before. Inside the SUV, Clara sat in silence at first, her hands clenched in her lap as the vehicle started with a screech of tires on the gravel. As the house receded into the distance, anguish took over her body, and she pounded on the window with her open palms. Her tears fell in torrents, and her voice broke in a desperate cry as she said, "Vincent, my son, help me, don't let them take me. Please, come back for me. Don't leave me alone like they did." Her voice echoed in the cabin, a lament so profound that even the driver looked away from the rearview mirror, uncomfortable with the stranger's pain. This is the ultimate betrayal. Using the law as a weapon, Hailey has just imprisoned her own mother. That desperate cry for Vincent is the only hope she has left. But the question is, will he find out before it's too late? But no one said anything. No one comforted her. The SUV continued on its way, leaving behind a cloud of dust and an entire neighborhood silenced by injustice. In another part of the city, Vincent was sitting in his office reviewing reports when the phone on his desk began to ring insistently. His assistant answered first, but soon his face changed to an expression of alarm, and he passed the receiver to Vincent, saying it was urgent. The voice on the other end of the line spoke quickly, brokenly, explaining what had happened in Oak Creek, how the daughter had signed the papers to commit Clara to a nursing home, and how they had taken her by force while the neighbors protested. Vincent felt a heat rise up his neck to his face. His hands clenched into fists on the desk, and his dark eyes lit up with a contained fury. He jumped to his feet. The chair slammed against the wall as it fell, and with a voice that sounded like thunder, he ordered his assistant to gather the legal team and a couple of trusted soldiers. He said he would not allow the mother who had restored his soul to be treated like a disposable object by those who should love her most. He said he would bring her back today, and that the world would know what happens when someone tries to take away the only family he has left. The office clock showed 9 inches the morning, but the air was already thick, as if it were midday, and the tension that could be cut with a knife seemed to fill every corner with an unbearable weight. Vincent stood by the window with his hands crossed behind his back, his uniform impeccable, his face hardened, and his eyes fixed on an invisible point beyond the buildings that formed the city's gray skyline. The news that Clara had been taken by her children to a nursing home under the pretext of dementia had hit him like a punch to the gut, and every time he remembered her desperate words, calling him, "My son, help me," he felt his blood boil with a mixture of rage and pain that he could barely contain. He spun on his heels with the precision of a trained soldier and called his assistant with a firm voice that allowed no delay. "Get the lawyers together immediately, and a trusted platoon. This morning, we are rescuing my mother, and I will make her real children pay for every tear they have made her shed." The assistant, a young, thin man, nodded nervously and ran out of the office without daring to ask any questions. Minutes later, the meeting room was filled with men and women in formal suits and tense faces, sitting around a long, polished wooden table, on which lay folders full of legal documents. Vincent observed them with the intensity of a lion stalking its prey. His dark eyes showed not the slightest hint of doubt as he explained in a grave voice that he would not allow Mrs. Clara Miller to remain one more day in that place where they had unjustly imprisoned her. He said, "Review every letter of the laws on elder protection and prepare an order to revoke her children's custody, arguing negligence and emotional abuse. Use the neighbors' testimonies, the recordings of the soldiers unloading supplies and furniture, and even the images of the empty house where they left her alone." The lawyers nodded one after another, taking quick notes and murmuring strategies among themselves. They knew their boss would not take no for an answer. Vincent continued in an even sterner tone, saying, "A child is not a child if they forget the one who gave them life. And I, although I do not share blood with Clara, will be for her the son that those ingrates never knew how to be." Meanwhile, in the courtyard of the nursing home where she had been admitted, Clara was sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of an old tree. Her wrinkled hands rested on her gray skirt, and her eyes, once full of light and determination, now seemed empty, like dry wells where not even hope dared to peek. Around her, other elderly people walked slowly, some with canes, others pushed in wheelchairs by assistants in white uniforms who spoke among themselves with indifference, not noticing the lost gazes of those they cared for. Clara barely blinked. Her lips moved in an inaudible whisper as she repeated like a prayer, "Vincent, my son, promise me you'll come. Promise me you won't leave me here forgotten." But no one heard her words. Not even the breeze that rustled the leaves seemed to pay attention. In her mind, the images of her home, transformed by the kindness of a stranger, the laughter of the neighborhood children as they watched her dance to Elvis Presley, and the light in Vincent's eyes when he told her she would never be alone again, replayed. All of it now felt like a dream too, beautiful to have been real. And in her chest, the pain of her own children's abandonment was an open wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. But miles away, the roar of engines broke the silence of the highway. A military convoy of 5 armored vehicles and 2 black SUVs sped forward, kicking up a cloud of dust that spread like an omen of justice. The soldiers, in impeccable uniforms, kept their eyes forward, while Vincent, sitting in the cabin of the first vehicle, spoke on the radio, giving precise orders and ensuring everything was ready for the rescue operation. His words were short, measured, but in each one, there was an almost visceral force, that of a man unwilling to lose again the mother figure that life had taken from him long ago. His gaze hardened as he remembered the fragility in Clara's voice, her pleading eyes hitting the window of the SUV as she was dragged away to confinement. Vincent murmured to himself in a tone that barely contained his anger, "I promise I won't fail this time, Mother. This time, I'll be on time." At the nursing home, the staff began to notice the sound of the approaching engines, first as a slight tremor in the ground, and then as a growing roar that made the windows vibrate. Some of the elderly residents looked up, curious, while the employees looked at each other with bewildered expressions, wondering what was happening. Clara, however, slowly lifted her head. Her tired eyes seemed to fill with a spark of hope when she recognized the cadence of those engines, as if her heart knew before her mind that Vincent was coming for her. She murmured, almost voiceless, "I knew you would come, my son. I knew you wouldn't abandon me." And she clung to the edge of the bench with trembling hands. The iron gate of the nursing home swung open with a crash as the first vehicle of the convoy stopped in front of the entrance. Vincent disembarked with a firm step. His upright figure and impeccable uniform commanded a silent respect that made the employees who tried to approach and ask what was happening back away. Two lawyers got out with folders in their hands and went directly to the administration, demanding the immediate release of Clara Miller under threat of pressing charges for illegal detention and abuse of authority. Vincent didn't wait for answers. He strode through the corridors of the nursing home, his boots echoing on the tiled floor, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if nothing could stand between him and the woman he had sworn to protect. Finally, he reached the courtyard, and there she was, sitting on the bench under the tree, her eyes full of tears and her lips murmuring his name over and over as if it were a prayer. Vincent stopped for a moment. He felt his chest fill with a mixture of relief and contained fury at seeing her so fragile, so reduced to a shadow of the strong woman who had sung, "You are my sunshine" to him in the rain. He took another step, then another, until he was in front of her, and with a voice thick with emotion, he extended his hand, saying, "Let's go home, Mother. You don't belong here anymore. I will keep my promise, and you will never be alone again." He came. He always comes. This is more than a rescue. It's a declaration. But simply getting her out isn't enough to stop Martin and Hailey. To truly protect Clara, Vincent knows he must fight them where they can't hide. A court of law. Clara looked at him, tears rolling uncontrollably, and with an almost childlike gesture, she placed her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, and in that simple but profound contact, they both knew that regardless of blood or legal ties, the bond that united them was real. It was family in its purest and most definitive form. The courtroom was charged with a tension so thick you could feel it on your skin like an electric current. The dark wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb the murmurs of those present, and the yellowish lights hung over their heads like inquisitive eyes that didn't miss a single movement. In the background, the constant clicking of the court reporter's keyboard recorded every word, while the clock marked the passing of seconds with an almost cruel rhythm. Vincent stood in the center of the room, his back straight and his immaculate uniform gleaming under the light. His gaze was firm and steady, a reflection of the unshakable determination that had brought him there, not just as an army officer, but as the son of the heart of a woman who had suffered too much at the hands of those who should have protected her. A few feet away sat Martin and Hailey on the defendant's bench, their faces rigid and their hands restless on their laps, dressed in elegant clothes that failed to hide the discomfort of being exposed before the law and the entire neighborhood, which had somehow come to this trial as a witness to an act of redemption and truth. Clara, sitting in the front row, had her hands clasped in her lap. Her thin fingers trembled slightly, and her eyes never left Vincent. In them, one could read a mixture of hope, fear, and a love so deep it seemed to hold her up, despite the months of abandonment and recent wounds. The judge, an older man with white hair and thick eyebrows, looked up over his glasses and called for silence in the courtroom with an authoritative tone that silenced even the most discreet whispers. Vincent stepped forward and in a firm voice began to recount the events from the beginning. His account was clear, detailed, leaving no room for doubt or interpretation, because every word was backed by evidence that lay in folders on the table. He stated that Mrs. Clara Miller, his mother of the heart, had been a victim of abandonment by her biological children, who, after stripping her of her belongings, left her to her fate in an empty house without food or company, and after he extended a hand to restore some of her dignity, they not only returned with baseless accusations, but also signed documents to have her committed to a nursing home, claiming dementia without medical justification. As Vincent spoke, Martin avoided his gaze, and Hailey clenched her jaw. Their expressions shifted between anger and nervousness, as if they didn't know how to counter the tide of truths that was drowning them in public. Vincent's lawyers stood up and requested the judge to play the videos provided by neighbors from the Oak Creek neighborhood. On the courtroom screen, images recorded with home cameras and phones began to appear. Martin and Hailey were clearly seen removing appliances, furniture, and even Clara's old radio, under the pretext that they no longer worked. The voices of neighbors protesting the cruel treatment of a woman who had given her life for her children could also be heard. One of the videos showed Clara sitting at the entrance of her house, alone, with the shawl over her shoulders and a lost look in her eyes, while a neighborhood child asked her why her children no longer came to visit. The murmurs grew in the room, and the judge called for silence, banging his gavel forcefully on the desk. His furrowed brow was a clear sign that what he was seeing was not indifferent to him. Then, several neighbors took the stand. An old woman with gray hair said in a trembling voice that Clara was always the first to offer help when someone needed it, and that seeing her abandoned had been one of the saddest things she had witnessed in the neighborhood. A tall man with calloused hands testified that he himself had seen how Captain Vincent arrived with trucks full of food and furniture to bring a little joy back to that house, and that this had provoked the envy of her children, who returned only to take away what was left. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin for Martin and Hailey, who shifted restlessly in their seats, aware that the truth was exposed for all to see, and there was no longer room for excuses. When it was Clara's turn, she stood with difficulty and walked to the stand. Her hands trembled, but her voice was clear. She did not look at Martin or Hailey. She looked at the judge. "For weeks," she said, her voice echoing slightly, "I sat in that empty house, wondering what I did wrong. I thought my life was over. I loved my children so much that I disappeared, so they could have everything, and when they left, I was nothing." She paused, then turned her head slightly towards Vincent, her eyes filling with tears. "But love, I learned, is not supposed to make you nothing. It is supposed to see you. My children," she said, finally looking at them, looked at me and saw a burden. This man, she motioned to Vincent, saw a mother. Her voice did not break. "That is my son. Not because I gave birth to him, but because he gave me back my life when he saw me, when others made me invisible." In that moment, Clara redefines family. It's not about blood, it's about who truly sees you. She has spoken her truth, and now the entire room, including the judge, must decide what justice really means. The judge sighed deeply and banged his gavel 3 more times before delivering his verdict in a voice that filled every corner of the room. He said, "The legal rights of Martin and Hailey Miller over Mrs. Clara Miller are hereby revoked due to abandonment and emotional abuse. From this moment on, they are prohibited from making decisions on her behalf or accessing her assets." The court recognizes the figure of Captain Vincent Ortega as her legal guardian for his evident commitment to the lady's well-being. Clara brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. Her knees gave way a little, but Vincent was there to catch her before she fell. He hugged her tightly as she cried on his shoulder, saying, "Thank you, my son. I knew you would keep your promise." And Vincent, in a low but emotional voice, replied, "I will never let them hurt you again, Mother. You are safe now, and you always will be with me." Applause erupted in the courtroom, not as a formality, but as a spontaneous act from those who had witnessed justice, an act that restored dignity to a mother and closed the door on the selfishness of 2 children who had forgotten their humanity. The morning unfolded over the country estate with a warm and serene glow that seemed taken from a painting. The sun filtered through the leafy trees, casting soft shadows on the stone paths. The song of birds filled the air with a lively melody that intertwined with the distant murmur of water in the central fountain, and a light breeze brought with it the sweet scent of the flowers blooming in the carefully tended gardens. Clara walked slowly, leaning on Vincent's arm. Her steps were short and measured, but there was a renewed firmness in them, as if each one brought her closer to a new beginning. Her eyes scanned every corner of that place with a mixture of wonder and gratitude that was hard to put into words, because the last time she had felt anything similar was decades ago when she managed to buy the small house in Oak Creek with the effort of years of work and sacrifice. But this time was different. Here, she didn't feel the weight of loneliness or the chill of bitter memories. Here, everything felt alive, welcoming, filled with the warmth of a home that didn't depend on walls or roofs, but on the people who lived in it. As they reached the main entrance, a group of children ran out to greet her. Their laughter echoed in the air as they approached, surrounding her with curiosity and affection. Some took her hands, others hugged her around the waist, and one of the smallest ones gently tugged on her skirt, saying with the purest innocence, "Grandma, come see the ducklings that were born yesterday." Clara felt her heart fill with a tenderness that moistened her eyes, and stroking the child's hair, she replied with a smile that hadn't appeared on her face in years, "Yes, I'll see them all soon, and I'll tell you stories like I used to with my own children when they were little." Vincent watched the scene from a step back with an expression that mixed pride and deep affection. He knew that bringing Clara to the estate was not just an act of justice, but an opportunity to give her the dignified and loving life she always deserved. Inside the house, the furniture shone with a soft gleam under the natural light that filtered through the large windows. Every detail had been chosen with care to make Clara feel comfortable and loved. From the hand-embroidered cushions to the knitted blanket resting on the rocking chair, strategically placed by the window with a view of the garden. On the oak table, a bouquet of fresh flowers filled the room with its fragrance, and a framed photograph of Vincent with his late mother rested to one side, like a silent symbol of the bond that now connected Clara to this new chapter of her life. Vincent took her hand gently and said, "Mother, this is your home now. Every corner, every flower, every smile from these children will be yours, because here there is no room for abandonment or sadness." Clara looked at him with tears of gratitude and replied, "I don't know how to thank you. I never imagined feeling so loved again. Even in the worst moments of my loneliness, I never dared to dream of something so beautiful." Hours later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Vincent invited her out to the back garden with a knowing gesture and a smile that hid a surprise. Clara walked beside him with the floral shawl over her shoulders, and the children followed them like a small, joyful procession. At the end of the stone path, Vincent stopped and, with a gesture, motioned for her to look ahead. Clara looked up and saw a splendid garden. Hundreds of rose bushes in full bloom, stretching out like a sea of colors, deep reds, pure whites, and soft pinks that swayed in the breeze. The air was filled with the sweet perfume of the flowers, and in the center, a wrought iron bench invited one to sit and contemplate the surrounding beauty. Vincent looked at her with shining eyes and said, "This garden is for you, Mother, for the queen of this house, because every petal owes its existence to a woman like you, who, despite the storms, continued to bloom." Clara brought her hands to her face, choked with tears, and could only stammer, "No one has ever given me such a beautiful gift. I feel blessed and alive again." She sat on the bench while Vincent knelt beside her to take her wrinkled hands in his, and told her that his mother would be happy to see her here because she always wanted him to care for someone with a heart as big as hers. Clara replied with a smile so broad and sincere that it lit up her weathered face, and in that moment there was no trace of the sadness, loneliness, or abandonment that had marked her for years. Because in that garden, surrounded by flowers, children's laughter, and the presence of a son that life had given her late, but with an unbreakable strength, Clara Miller felt complete for the first time in a long time, as if the universe were whispering in her ear that there were still beautiful chapters left to live. The afternoon was settling over the estate with an almost surreal calm. The sky was painted in deep oranges and pale pinks that seemed to melt on the horizon, while a gentle breeze, carrying the perfume of the rose bushes, caressed the branches of the trees and made the dry leaves rustle under Clara's slow steps as she walked along the stone path with the floral shawl over her shoulders and her hands clasped in her lap. Her eyes serenely gazed at the garden that Vincent had planted for her, and her breathing was calm, as if she had finally found a rhythm where her heart didn't ache. Each step took her back to the wrought iron bench where she used to sit and knit, while the soldiers' children played around her, calling her grandma and filling the air with clean laughter that contrasted with the heavy silences that had once marked her life. But that afternoon, the air carried another vibration, a different murmur that was not of games or children's songs, but of something dragging itself from the main entrance. A sound of contained weeping and unsure steps on the gravel that made Clara stop halfway with an intuition that tightened her chest. Vincent appeared at the edge of the path, his imposing silhouette outlined by the warm evening light, his expression more serious than usual. He approached Clara with almost solemn respect and said in a low voice, "Mother, there are 2 people at the entrance who claim to be your children. They want to see you. They are crying and asking to speak with you." Clara felt her heart skip a beat, and her hands tightened on the shawl, as if the fabric could protect her from the avalanche of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. For a moment, she wanted to say no, that she wasn't ready, but a part of her, which still held the echo of so many sleepless nights praying for those ungrateful children, made her nod with an almost inaudible whisper, "Bring them here." Vincent nodded with a firm gesture and walked away as the sounds became clearer, clumsy steps on the stone, sobs, and broken words carried by the breeze to Clara's ears, who remained standing with her gaze fixed on the horizon and her eyes misty with tears that had not yet fallen. Martin was the first to appear. His disheveled figure contrasted with the arrogance he used to carry on his shoulders. His suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked, and his eyes red from crying. Behind him, Hailey walked with faltering steps, her high heels sinking slightly into the gravel, and her makeup smudged by the tears that stained her cheeks in dark streaks. Upon reaching Clara, they both knelt on the stone, Hailey not caring about the damage the pebbles did to her knees, nor Martin about the dust staining his expensive pants. Their faces were lifted towards the woman who had loved them unconditionally, their lips trembling and their hands extended as if imploring absolution for all their sins. At once, Hailey was the first to speak, her voice broken by sobs. "Mom, we were fools, so blind. We couldn't see everything you did for us. We didn't understand your love or return it as you deserved. And now we are here with nothing but our regret, asking you to please forgive us, to give us one last chance to show that we can be the children you always deserved." Martin added in an equally desperate tone, "Mother, I feel like a monster every night. I remember your tears in the SUV when we took you to the nursing home, and I feel like the remorse is eating me from the inside out. I came because I can't live with this guilt anymore. I need you to know that if I could go back, I would do everything differently. I wouldn't take your radio. I wouldn't leave you alone. I would hug you every day and tell you I love you, because now I know that no one lasts forever and that mothers are a gift you can't replace." Clara looked at them for a long time without saying a word. Her eyes were 2 mirrors where Martin and Hailey could see reflected all the sadness they had caused, and also a glimpse of the strong woman who had raised them alone, enduring poverty, illness, and sleepless nights without complaint. Her breathing was calm, but each inhalation seemed filled with a serene strength that didn't need to raise its voice to command respect. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but so firm that it seemed to fill the entire garden with an echo that made the leaves on the trees tremble. She told them, "I forgive you because my heart doesn't know how to hold a grudge, because I still remember the smell of your little heads asleep on my chest and the small hands that reached for me when you were scared in the night. But I also tell you that I am no longer your burden, nor your responsibility, nor the woman you can return to when life gets hard, because now I have a son of the heart, a man who, owing me nothing, chose to see me when you made me invisible. And thanks to him, I know there is still love in the world." She forgives them not for them, but for herself. This is the moment Clara truly reclaims her power, setting her boundaries while keeping her heart open. Their chapter is closed, and now Clara's new life can finally, truly begin. Martin bowed his head, choked with tears, while Hailey sobbed with her hands covering her face, unable to bear her mother's gaze. Vincent remained a few steps back, watching the scene in silence, his arms crossed over his chest and a contained expression that hid the emotion he felt, hearing Clara reclaim her voice and her power. The soldiers' children who were playing nearby approached curiously upon seeing the 2 adults crying on their knees, and one of them took Clara's hand, asking, "Grandma, who are they?" Clara bent down a little to stroke the little boy's head and replied with a sad smile, They are just people who one day forgot what it means to love, and now they are trying to remember." The boy nodded without fully understanding, while Vincent stepped forward to place a firm hand on Clara's shoulder and said in a low voice, "Mother, that's enough. You have been brave. Now you deserve to rest." Clara smiled at him with infinite tenderness and rested her head on the shoulder of the man that destiny had given her as a true son. While in the distance, the sun finished setting, painting the sky a deep red that seemed to seal the end of a chapter full of pain to open another full of dignity and love. The evening fell over the estate with a blessed serenity. The sky was dressed in warm tones ranging from amber to crimson as the sun slowly descended behind the hills, and the long shadows of the trees mingled with the sweet scent of the blooming rose bushes. The air was soft and warm, filled with the laughter of children running barefoot on the cool grass, chasing butterflies and letting out little giggles that filled every corner of the garden. With the purity of childhood, Clara sat in the wooden rocking chair that Vincent had specially built for her. Her thin body was wrapped in a shawl woven with colorful threads that seemed to catch the light of the sunset. Her wrinkled hands moved delicately as she knitted a sky-blue scarf for one of the little ones who had approached her days before, asking her to teach him to knit like his grandmother did. Her fingers worked patiently, but her gaze went beyond the needles, lost in the contemplation of a present she never thought possible. Her eyes filled with a moist shine when she heard Vincent's guitar in the distance. Each note floated in the air like a loving whisper that caressed her heart and mended the last cracks of the pain she had carried for so many years. Vincent was on the terrace, sitting in a wicker chair with the guitar resting on his knee. His firm fingers moved over the strings with a skill that spoke of years of practice, and his deep, warm voice rose to the rhythm of "You Are My Sunshine," the same song that Clara had hummed on a rainy afternoon to comfort him when his heart was torn by the absence of his biological mother. Now it was he who sang it with solemn respect, but also with sincere joy, like a son who had finally learned the true meaning of caring and being cared for. His gaze rested on Clara from time to time, and in those seconds, one could see a love so genuine that it needed no words, because the music was the bridge that united their souls in a deep understanding of all they had been through together. The children in the garden began to approach silently. Some sat on the grass, forming a small semicircle in front of the terrace. Others rested on their arms, watching with bright eyes as that tall, strong man sang with a tenderness rarely seen in adults. One of them whispered to another, "The captain has the voice of an angel," and Clara, who heard the phrase, let out a soft laugh that crinkled the corners of her lips even more. As the notes of "You Are My Sunshine" filled the air with a sweet melancholy, Clara closed her eyes, letting the music envelop her like a warm hug. She could feel in each chord the fulfilled promise of never being alone again. In each sung word, the certainty that love doesn't always come from where you expect it, but it arrives when you need it most. Her mind wandered through the memories of a life full of sacrifices, of sleepless nights sewing until her fingers ached, of silent tears when her children forgot her. But now those memories didn't have the sharp edge they used to, because Vincent had wrapped them in a new meaning. She thought about how that broken man she found crying in the rain had become the son she always dreamed of, one who called her mother with a respect and affection so real that it erased the scars of abandonment. As the rocking chair creaked softly under her weight, Clara felt a peace so profound that for the first time in years, she breathed without the knot in her chest that had accompanied her for so long. Vincent raised his voice in the final chorus, and the children began to applaud with an innocent enthusiasm that echoed in the garden like tinkling bells. Clara slowly opened her eyes and directed them towards the horizon where the sun was. Saying goodbye with a burst of colors that painted the sky in oranges and violets, her lips curved into a calm smile. The kind of smile that is born not from fleeting happiness, but from the certainty of having finally found a place in the world. Her fingers stopped knitting and rested on her lap as she murmured in a low but firm voice, "It's never too late to be a mother again." Her words were lost in the warm evening air, but Vincent, who had finished playing, heard them clearly and felt a lump in his throat. He looked up at her and nodded in silence, like someone who recognizes they have just witnessed a sacred moment. The children continued to play around Clara, their laughter mixed with the chirping of the crickets that were beginning to wake. And the final image was that of a woman sitting in her rocking chair, surrounded by love, with the golden evening light caressing her face and a son of the heart by her side, reminding her that there is always a second chance to be reborn. The shadows were growing long, but my mind had never felt so clear. Vincent's guitar wasn't just music, it was a confirmation. The pain that once anchored me to the past had finally lifted. I realized I had mistaken blood for family. A mother's love isn't an obligation, but an instinct to give. When I offered it to Vincent in the rain, it returned to heal me. I was no longer Clara, the abandoned one. I was mother. I was grandma, loved by a family my heart had chosen. If stories of healing and the power of kindness resonate with you, please subscribe to the channel to help us spread more meaningful messages.